It is the kind of royal scandal that feels more like a Shakespearean drama than modern-day headline news. Rumor has it that Queen Camilla literally forced her way into the ultra-secure royal jewelry vault, walking away with three of Kate Middleton's most prized tiaras without so much as a whisper of permission. Within just 24 hours, the flimsy excuse she offered for taking them completely crumbled to dust. Today, you and I are going to unpack this staggering power move step by step, because when you look closely at the official narrative, it simply does not make sense. Prince William was reportedly so furious that his reaction left the entire staff at Buckingham Palace reeling in absolute shock. To understand the sheer magnitude of this clash, we have to look closely at the timeline, because that is where the cracks in the official palace story first begin to show. Everything supposedly kicked off around October 28th, with two massive royal events looming on the calendar. First, on November 12th, Queen Consort Camilla was scheduled to host a highly prestigious reception for the Booker Prize finalists. Then, a mere 48 hours later, on November 14th, King Charles was set to travel all the way to South Wales to celebrate his official birthday. With two major events stacked back to back, the palace was under immense pressure, and Camilla took an unusually hands-on role in the preparations. No detail was too small for the Queen Consort, as she personally oversaw every single aspect of the upcoming celebrations. We are talking about her micromanaging royal protocol, guest lists, elaborate lighting, and even the Italian silk fabrics for the decor. She even went so far as to fly in rare, expensive floral arrangements from overseas because she wanted everything to look absolutely flawless. To the outside observer, it just looked like a dedicated royal doing her job, and by early November, everything seemed perfectly on track. But behind the heavy oak doors of the private quarters, a silent storm was brewing. The ultimate symbol of royal status, the tiara, was about to spark an unprecedented civil war. Within the British monarchy, a tiara is never just a piece of jewelry. It is a loud declaration of power, rank, and historical legacy. Every single diamond and sapphire tells a story of who holds the real influence within the family. So, when Camilla sat down for her final wardrobe fittings, she realized she had a major crisis on her hands. For the Booker Prize reception, she had chosen a striking deep blue gown, and for the king's birthday, a pristine ivory outfit. Yet, as her stylist began sorting through her personal collection, a troubling reality set in. Absolutely none of the headpieces officially allocated to her matched either of these highly anticipated looks. A few of the options clashed terribly with the blue gown, while others looked far too heavy, outdated, or were simply locked away for routine maintenance. Now, let us pause for a second, because this excuse simply does not hold up under close scrutiny. Camilla is not a newcomer to the royal stage. She has attended hundreds of state events and has an entire team dedicated to her wardrobe. The idea that she suddenly realized she had nothing to wear just days before two massive events is highly suspicious. Royal fashion is mapped out months, sometimes even a year, in advance, with meticulous precision. This was either a historic planning failure or something far more calculated was at play. If the official story about a sudden wardrobe emergency is a lie, then the jewelry crisis was never actually about finding the right match. As the clock kept ticking, the Queen Consort's frustration reportedly reached a boiling point behind closed doors. Desperate to get her hands on the perfect piece, she turned her gaze beyond her own designated collection and focused on the Princess of Wales. Kate Middleton famously curated an exquisite selection of tiaras, including the breathtaking Oriental Circle tiara. It was elegant, versatile, and deeply symbolic of Kate's rising status. On the evening of November 4th, after an exhausting day of meetings, Camilla decided to take matters into her own hands. The tension finally boiled over in a quiet, dimly lit corridor of the palace where Camilla cornered Kate Middleton. According to those familiar with the exchange, the Queen Consort bypassed all polite protocol with a direct demand disguised as a casual statement. She told Kate she heard the Oriental Circle tiara was free and that it would be perfect for her upcoming events. Kate was caught completely off guard by this aggressive approach, but remained polite, explaining that she had already scheduled that specific piece for her own upcoming engagements. It was a completely normal and professional boundary to set, but observers claim that Camilla's face immediately hardened into a mask of cold anger. With a dismissive wave, The queen consort sharply told Kate that she had plenty of other jewelry and did not need this specific tiara. Kate, keeping her composure under immense pressure, quietly reminded her that the piece had been officially assigned to her and her entire wardrobe was already designed around it. That is when the argument took a dark and highly personal turn. Camilla reportedly snapped, demanding to know why Kate always tried to hog the spotlight, reminding her in no uncertain terms that she was talking to the Queen of England. She made it clear that when she demands cooperation for the crown, she expects it immediately. Kate could only stare back, deeply shocked by the raw hostility. Stepping directly into the younger woman's personal space, Camilla coldly warned Kate that she needed to remember her place in the hierarchy. She declared that everything in the palace ultimately belonged to the crown, and she alone would decide what was necessary. After a tense, agonizing silence, Kate drew herself up, pale but remarkably steady, and softly promised to see what arrangements could be made before walking away. Let us be entirely honest about what transpired in that hallway. This was never a simple disagreement over a sparkly hairpiece. It was a ruthless demonstration of raw authority meant to put the future queen in her place. Even though Kate tried to be cooperative, the trap had already been set. By the time the sun came up the next morning, quiet whispers were already echoing through the cold stone corridors of the palace. Loyal staff members whispered in small huddles, sensing the intense friction between the two most powerful women in the monarchy, though few knew the exact details of the clash. Most assumed the disagreement would be quietly swept under the rug, as royal protocol usually demands, but that fragile peace was completely shattered just before noon. Without warning, Camilla's personal security detail, her head designer, and two high-ranking palace officials marched directly toward the heavily guarded royal jewelry vault on an unannounced mission. The sudden, unscheduled arrival immediately set off alarm bells for the security officer standing guard outside the massive vault doors. He stepped forward cautiously, noting that the items they were asking for were strictly registered under the name of the Princess of Wales. Camilla's lead designer did not hesitate, coldly stating they were operating under direct orders from the Queen Consort herself. When the guard asked the critical question of whether Kate had authorized the release, Camilla's security officer snapped back that Catherine was not the Queen. Another loyal aide stepped in to seal the deal, declaring that Her Majesty's demands always took absolute precedence over any protocol. Feeling the immense pressure, the reluctant guard had no choice but to authorize the opening of the heavy vault doors. Under the soft, golden gallery lights, rows of priceless, historic jewels began to shimmer in the dark. First, they pulled the Oriental Circle tiara, the exact piece that had caused the explosive fight just 12 hours prior. But they did not stop there. They also took the legendary Cambridge Lover's Knot tiara, famously worn by Princess Diana, and the delicate lotus flower tiara, both of which are deeply personal to Kate. All three historic treasures were packed away for Camilla's private fittings. Just stop and think about the sheer audacity of that moment for a second. The Princess of Wales had been asked for a single headpiece and had politely promised to find a solution. Yet behind her back, without her knowledge or signature, an entire collection of her designated jewelry was cleared out of the vault. This was not a routine request to borrow an accessory. It felt like a coordinated raid designed to send a devastating message. By the time senior palace officials realized what had actually happened, the damage was already done. To those working deep within the royal household, this did not look like a wardrobe mix-up at all. It looked like a calculated, public display of dominance, meant to show everyone exactly who rules the house. The devastating news finally reached the Princess of Wales at exactly 4:30 in the afternoon. She was resting in her private sitting room when the longtime head of the Royal Jewelry Vault, John Harrington, requested an urgent private audience. His face was pale and his posture was incredibly stiff as he delivered the shocking news. He explained the sudden, unscheduled raid, the aggressive demands made in the Queen Consort's name, and the unauthorized removal of 3 of her most beloved tiaras. Catherine sat in stunned silence, her hands clenched tightly in her lap as the reality set in. When her loyal jeweler confirmed he had tried to stop it, she could only let out a long, quiet breath. Today, you and I are going to unpack a shocking royal showdown that went down behind closed doors. It started when a flash of pure anger crossed Catherine's face, though her years of royal training quickly kicked in. She straightened up, nodded calmly, and told the messenger he did the right thing. Once he left, she sat in total silence, battling disbelief. An hour later, she marched straight to Camilla's private office. The queen consort was there, surrounded by her designer, her dresser, and 2 senior aides. The room fell completely silent the moment Catherine stepped inside. "May I speak with you?" Catherine asked, keeping her voice firm. Camilla looked up, clearly annoyed, and snapped, "Say it here. I have nothing to hide." Refusing to back down, Catherine stepped forward and asked her question directly. "Why were my tiaras taken without my permission? I told you I would arrange the one you asked for, yet you went ahead and took 2 more. Camilla's lips tightened into a thin line. "I took what was needed because you were behaving as though you were already the queen," she replied coldly. A quiet murmur rippled through the staff in the room. Catherine stiffened but stood her ground, declaring that those specific tiaras were assigned to her and that protocol and respect still mattered. Camilla let out a sharp, mocking laugh. "Respect? You seem to forget who actually wears the crown now. I am the queen. I do not ask, I decide." With quiet dignity, Catherine replied, "This is not about power, it is about boundaries." Camilla leaned back in her chair, a cold smirk playing on her face. "You are mistaken. It is always about power." The onlookers stood frozen, watching this raw power struggle unfold right in front of them. Catherine was being openly humiliated, yet she refused to lose her cool or raise her voice. "You took 3 tiaras, not 1, she pointed out. "That was entirely unnecessary." Camilla's eyes narrowed to slits. "I took them because I could." A heavy silence fell over the room. Catherine took a deep breath. "Then understand this. This will not be forgotten." She turned and walked out, looking calm but with her hands trembling at her sides. That parting line was not a threat, but a simple statement of fact, and given the chaos that followed, it was easily the most accurate thing spoken that day. Later that evening, while Catherine was trying to collect her thoughts in private, a soft, polite knock sounded at her door. It was Lady Eleanor Whitmore, a senior palace advisor who was famous for her strict loyalty to protocol. Having worked by Catherine's side for years, she had deep access to the palace's inner workings. She admitted she would never disturb the princess unless it was urgent. Catherine asked what wrong, and Eleanor hesitated. She then explained that a wardrobe staff member had reached out after overhearing a fitting. "The lotus flower tiara," Eleanor whispered, "is not being prepared for the queen." Lola Parker Bowles. Hearing that name felt like a physical blow. "A non-royal?" Catherine whispered in shock. Eleanor nodded to confirm the devastating news. The historic tiara was being readied for a completely private appearance, with no official duties or royal events attached to it. Catherine felt the room spin. This was not merely bad manners, it was a flagrant violation of the crown's strict rules. Royal tiaras are strictly forbidden from being loaned out for personal family vanity, especially to non-working family members. "This was never about necessity," Catherine said softly, realizing the truth. It was a direct message. Eleanor nodded in agreement, saying she felt Catherine had to know. The princess thanked her, but as the door closed, sadness took over. The official cover story was that these precious tiaras were required for upcoming state events. Palace officials claimed they were needed for the high-profile Booker Prize reception and the king's birthday celebration. But the truth was far more scandalous. One of those 3 pieces was never meant for any official state duty. Instead, it was being prepped for a private party for someone completely outside the working royal family. This meant the high-security vault had been accessed under false pretenses. At the very least, the sheer volume of jewels taken went far beyond any genuine royal need. The fact that a staff member on the wardrobe team felt so deeply uncomfortable that they had to report this breach shows how wrong the entire situation was. It was clear that even the palace staff knew a major line had been crossed. That night at dinner, a heavy silence hung over the table. Since William was away on an official assignment, Catherine was left to handle the children on her own. George was the first to notice something was wrong, asking softly, "Mommy, are you okay?" Charlotte studied her mother's face next, whispering that she looked incredibly sad. Catherine forced a reassuring smile. I am perfectly fine, sweethearts. It was just a very long day, and I really miss your father. That is all. But the kids could sense the tension. Later that night, as she tucked them in, Catherine finally let her guard down. The quiet palace felt freezing, and the deep personal sting of the insult could no longer be ignored. By the next morning, the entire palace was buzzing with nervous energy. Servants whispered behind closed doors, advisors checked schedules repeatedly, and the security guards stood noticeably straighter. Rumors were spreading like wildfire that Prince William and Princess Anne might be cutting their trip short. For Catherine, this sudden news brought an overwhelming wave of relief. William was not scheduled to return until the 6th of the month, so the thought of having him back early filled her heart with absolute warmth. She did not care about schedules or royal protocol, she just needed her husband home. He was the only one who could anchor her through this storm. That morning, her spirits lifted, her smile softened, and the staff instantly noticed her lighter energy. "She seems so much happier today," one aide whispered quietly to another, but that temporary joy was brutally short-lived. Right before noon, Catherine decided to dial William directly, desperate to hear the confirmation from his own mouth. When his warm, familiar voice came through the receiver saying, "Hello, love," her chest tightened. "I heard you might be coming home early," she said. "Is it true?" An incredibly heavy silence stretched across the line before William spoke gently. "I am so sorry, but there has been a massive scheduling error. Anne and I have to stay here and return on the 6th as originally planned." Catherine shut her eyes tightly. "I know this is incredibly disappointing, but I will be home soon," she answered softly. "Yes, of course. I understand." That fleeting sense of happiness instantly vanished, replaced by a familiar, heavy ache. The stolen tiaras, the bitter confrontation, and those harsh words spoken behind closed doors all came rushing back at once. William was more than just a husband. He was her absolute sanctuary, her best friend, and the single person she trusted with her deepest pain. She desperately wanted to tell him everything right then, but she had to wait. The long nights dragged on painfully. Finally, on the morning of November 7th, the entire energy shifted. Prince William and Princess Anne arrived back at the palace after completing their formal briefing with the king. The kids sprinted toward William the second they saw him, George clinging to his leg while Charlotte and Louis jumped into his arms. For a brief moment, Catherine allowed a genuine smile to cross her face. It was tiny and fast, but it was absolutely real. Seeing William back where he belonged, hearing his voice echo in the halls, and watching him play with the children brought a profound sense of stability back to her life. For days, she had survived on pure discipline and willpower. Now, the heavy burden on her chest finally started to ease up, but the peace would not last. Later that night, once dinner was over and the children were fast asleep, a quiet calm fell over the halls. The staff went home, the footsteps stopped, and the couple retreated to their private quarters. If you have ever felt like you had to carry the weight of the world alone, you know exactly what Catherine was going through. Behind the heavy doors of their private wing, the rest of the world finally faded away. William shut the door, locked it, and turned to look at his wife. He did not need to ask any questions. One look at her rigid shoulders and exhausted eyes told him everything. The flawless public mask she wore so effortlessly was starting to crumble. "You do not look okay at all," he said gently. "What is going on?" Catherine tried to speak, but her throat tightened up completely. She shook her head, trying to brush it off as nothing. William stepped closer, his voice dropping to a protective whisper. "No, tell me the truth. Something has happened." Exhaling slowly, she sank onto the sofa, tightly locking her fingers together in her lap. For several agonizing seconds, she simply stared at the floor, gathering what little strength she had left. "While you were away, something went completely wrong," she finally confessed. William sat down next to her on the couch and urged, "Tell me everything." And so she did. At first, the details came slowly as she recounted Camilla's aggressive demands. She described the hallway confrontation, the icy tone, and how those dismissive words were designed to make her feel small and powerless. Then she broke the news about the secure vault, explaining how 3 of her tiaras had been confiscated without her permission. She described standing there in front of the palace staff, having her authority completely undermined, and her dignity stripped away. The devastating final blow came when she spoke of the lotus flower tiara. This sacred piece of royal heritage had not even been taken for official duty, but rather for the personal use of someone completely outside the royal family. Tears slowly slipped down her cheeks, and she let them fall, having held back her pain for far too long. William listened in absolute silence, his eyes locked onto her, every single muscle in his body rigid with controlled fury. When she finally finished speaking, the silence in the room became heavy and painful. At last, William spoke in a low, dangerous tone, saying that such behavior was entirely unacceptable and that she should have never been treated with such disrespect. Gently shaking her head, Catherine explained that this was not just a simple power play, but an active attempt to erase her presence. William studied her face intently, urging her to explain further. After taking a deep breath to steady her shaking nerves, she admitted that while he knew the jewels, she had never truly shared what they meant to her. He nodded once, giving her his full attention. She started with the Oriental Circle, one of the very first tiaras trusted to her after she became the Princess of Wales. It was a subtle piece, she said, one that did not demand attention but carried a deep, quiet strength, much like Queen Alexandra when she wore it during difficult times. That subtle crown always reminded her that true leadership does not need to shout to be incredibly powerful. William watched her with a softening expression as she moved on to the next piece. The Cambridge lover's knot, she said with a tightening voice, carried a massive weight because it belonged to Diana, who wore it so often. When the public sees her wearing it, they do not just see diamonds, they see the late princess, and she never wore it lightly. She only wore it when she felt strong enough to carry that heavy memory and honor the legacy Diana never got to finish. William's jaw tightened with emotion, but he remained silent as she paused before mentioning the lotus flower tiara. According to Catherine, that specific tiara symbolized renewal, growth, and grace under intense pressure. She had worn it during a time when she was still struggling to find her place within the royal family, a period when she desperately needed a reminder that personal evolution is painful but necessary. Yet, someone had taken it away, not to serve the crown, but simply to make a cruel point. As tears welled in her eyes, William reached across and squeezed her hands tightly. She whispered that these pieces were not mere jewelry, but physical representations of her personal journey. William stared at her, his voice absolute, as he promised her that this would not end this way. Her only desire was to be treated with simple dignity. William did not hesitate to reassure her, declaring that she deserved both dignity and respect and that he would ensure she received them. Hearing the absolute conviction in his voice allowed her to finally let go of her composure. She leaned forward, resting her head against his shoulder as he wrapped his arms around her in a protective embrace. He whispered that he should have been there to protect her, to which she replied that his presence now was all that mattered. For the first time in days, she felt safe. Yet, as William held her, his gaze remained cold and focused, knowing this battle was far from over. By 6:54 the next morning, he was awake. Sleep had been elusive for William all night, but when he finally opened his eyes, his mind was sharp and resolved. There would be no hesitation, no endless committee meetings, and no diplomatic delays. The insult she had suffered could not go unanswered. Just 6 minutes later, Catherine stirred next to him, her eyes heavy with sleep as she turned over in the bed. Before she could even mutter a morning greeting, William broke the silence by stating they were going to act immediately on this very day. Catherine sat up slowly, pushing her hair away from her face in confusion, pointing out that it was barely dawn. When she asked where and how they would act, his face remained entirely serious. Without raising his voice or rushing his words, William explained that they were going to handle this situation the proper way. Catherine knit her brows together, asking exactly who they would be addressing. He looked directly into her eyes and told her they were going to speak with his father, the king. That statement instantly cleared any remaining sleep from her mind. She stared at the blankets in silence before looking back up to confirm if he meant today. He confirmed it. She had countless questions and worries racing through her mind, but she chose to remain silent. After days of practicing intense restraint, she agreed to the plan, prompting William to promise he would never let this insult be swept under the rug. Affectionately squeezing his fingers, She whispered that she knew he would protect her. The couple got out of bed, and Catherine walked to the window, drawing the heavy curtains just enough to let the morning light spill into the room. Outside, the manicured palace grounds looked peaceful and entirely indifferent to the storm brewing indoors. It made her realize how easily deep pain could be hidden behind beautiful, historic walls. She dressed with deliberate care, selecting a simple, structured outfit that felt like a protective layer of armor. William dressed in a similar fashion, their movements silent but perfectly in sync. As they sat down for a quiet breakfast, she barely touched a single bite of her food. Rather than feeling anger, she felt a profound sense of disappointment over how such a deeply personal matter had been handled with utter disregard. By 9 o'clock in the morning, they were fully prepared to face the day. Walking down the grand corridors, Catherine felt a strange mixture of nervous energy and absolute calm, knowing she would not have to face this trial by herself. William held the door open, assuring her they would handle this together. She straightened her shoulders, whispering to herself that keeping her dignity did not require her to remain silent. When they finally arrived outside King Charles's private chambers, the quietness of the long hallway was almost unsettling. Only a few members of the household staff could be seen in the distance, their footsteps muffled by the heavy carpets. William kept a steady pace while Catherine walked beside him with rigid posture, her hands tightly clasped together. When they reached the reception area, the secretary looked up from her desk and froze in surprise, stammering that she had not expected them. William offered a polite but firm nod, stating they needed to see the king immediately. The secretary hesitated, noting they were not on the official schedule. William calmly replied that they would wait. You and I can easily imagine the thick tension in that small sitting area as they were escorted inside to wait for the monarch. As Catherine sat down, she carefully smoothed the fabric of her skirt, while William paced the room before finally sitting beside her. The silence in the waiting area felt heavy and unnatural as the minutes dragged on. Catherine stared straight ahead, but her mind was racing as she felt the rapid thud of her heartbeat. She had never wanted to initiate a confrontation like this, but the circumstances left her with no other choice. William glanced at his watch, and barely 15 minutes had gone by before the sound of brisk footsteps echoed down the hallway. King Charles appeared with a folder tucked under his arm, stopping dead in his tracks the second he noticed them waiting there. The king admitted he had no idea they were visiting, to which William simply replied that they urgently needed to speak with him. Charles carefully studied their tense faces, instantly realizing from their grim expressions that this was not a social visit. He gestured for them to follow him into his private study, closing the heavy wooden door to shut out the rest of the bustling palace. After placing his folder on the desk, he asked what was happening. William waited until Catherine was comfortably seated before explaining that their visit concerned a very serious breach of protocol. Charles frowned at the accusation, telling them to proceed as Catherine took a deep breath to steady her voice. With quiet determination, Catherine revealed that 3 precious tiaras under her direct care had been taken from the vault without her knowledge or permission. Charles spun around to face her, demanding confirmation that this had indeed happened without her consent. She confirmed it was true, listing the Oriental Circle, the Cambridge Lover's Knot, and the Lotus Flower Tiara. The king's face grew incredibly tense as he asked who could have possibly authorized such an action. William delivered the answer clearly, stating it was Camilla. A heavy silence filled the study as Charles leaned back in his chair, guessing there was more to the story, which Catherine confirmed by explaining how the initial request had been made. The items had been taken directly in front of the palace staff without any prior consultation. Charles looked visibly disturbed, admitting that such an incident never should have occurred. Catherine quietly added that there was even more to the story. When Charles urged her to continue, she explained that the lotus flower tiara had not been removed for any official royal duty. The king frowned in confusion, prompting her to explain that she was told the piece was meant for the personal use of someone who was not even a member of the royal family. As the weight of those words settled over the room, Charles sighed, calling it highly inappropriate, while William pointed out that this was an abuse of authority meant to humiliate. It was an unprecedented confrontation, a moment where long-held patience finally shattered. Inside the quiet confines of the study, the tension was thick enough to cut with a knife. Charles rubbed his temples, his face lined with the sudden, heavy burden of what he was hearing. Catherine stood firm, her voice steady as she made it clear she sought no conflict, only the boundaries and respect her position deserved. Beside her, William demanded absolute clarity, insisting this breach could never happen again. After a long, agonizing silence, the king finally sat up. He admitted things had been handled poorly, looking directly at Catherine to offer a rare, quiet apology. With a promise to handle it himself, the meeting came to a tense close. Let's look closely at this pivotal moment, because what seemed like the end of the meeting was actually just the beginning. Charles locked eyes with his son, giving a solemn promise to address the crisis, bringing a brief, heavy silence to the room. But as William and Catherine turned to leave, the king suddenly called out, halting them in their tracks. He stood motionless, clearly wrestling with a massive decision before commanding them to sit back down. Catherine felt a familiar knot of anxiety tighten in her chest, sensing that something far larger was unfolding. Then, with a cold, deliberate motion, Charles reached for his desk phone, summoned the Queen Consort immediately, and sank back into his leather chair. An oppressive weight settled over the study as they waited in absolute, unbroken silence. When the door finally clicked open, Camilla walked in with her usual air of effortless confidence, a polite smile on her lips. That smile vanished the instant she noticed William and Catherine sitting there, her expression instantly shifting to one of cold defense. She took a seat, folding her hands neatly, and demanded to know what was going on. Charles did not mince words, confronting her directly about the unauthorized removal of several historic tiaras from the royal vault. Camilla did not flinch, instantly defending her actions by claiming she was simply showing respect for the institution, arguing the jewels belonged to no single person. Though William visibly bristled at her words, he chose to remain silent, letting the drama play out. Camilla pressed on, defending her choices by insisting that major events required swift executive decisions from her as the Queen Consort. Catherine remained perfectly still, her face an unreadable mask of composure even as her fingers locked tightly together. That was when Charles intervened, raising a hand to cut through the excuses, reminding his wife that royalty does not bypass established rules. Camilla boldly countered that rules must bend when people forget their place, a sharp jab that hung heavily in the air. But Charles shut her down instantly, his voice turning icy as he declared that this was not how the monarchy functions. The king made it clear that this entire debacle was a severe blow to the public standing of the House of Windsor. He called it a direct insult to Catherine that should never have occurred, causing Camilla to visibly stiffen. Charles then issued a strict decree, demanding all 3 tiaras be returned to the vault immediately with absolutely no exceptions. But he did not stop there, delivering a punishment that stunned everyone in the room. He banned Camilla from wearing a tiara at the upcoming Booker Prize reception and his own landmark birthday events. The room fell into a stunned, heavy silence as Camilla's confidence completely crumbled. Realizing she had lost this battle, she slowly nodded in bitter acceptance. Confirming his ultimate authority, Charles offered a soft, genuine apology to his daughter-in-law. He expressed deep regret that she had been dragged into such an unnecessary conflict, to which Catherine responded with a polite, respectful nod. William rose to his feet, thanking his father for taking decisive action, and Charles declared the matter officially closed. Behind the scenes, the palace machine moved with clinical speed, ensuring that the Oriental Circle, the Cambridge Lover's Knot, and the Lotus Flower Tiara were locked away in the vault by noon. No public statements were made, keeping the feud strictly behind closed doors. But when the Booker Prize reception arrived, observers noticed something highly unusual. You and I both know that in the royal world, what you do not wear speaks far louder than what you do. Camilla arrived at the reception completely bareheaded, opting instead for a striking sapphire necklace and matching earrings. While the general public assumed this was just a sophisticated fashion statement, royal experts immediately began to whisper. The press floated theories about a modern look or a simple change of heart, completely oblivious to the bitter power struggle behind the scenes. This conspicuous lack of a tiara continued through the king's birthday celebrations, leaving the public baffled. But the ultimate shockwave hit weeks later at a grand state banquet when Catherine walked in wearing the stunning Oriental Circle tiara. Glittering under the ballroom lights, The legendary headpiece looked absolutely breathtaking on the princess. The public and the press swooned over the photos, praising her effortless grace and how naturally the crown seemed to sit upon her head. But for Catherine, this was never about mere vanity or playing dress-up. This was a silent, powerful statement of boundaries, a masterclass in maintaining dignity and commanding respect without ever having to raise her voice. As she glided through the elite crowd with absolute composure, those in the inner circle understood the profound message she was sending. Some crowns are not simply taken by force, they are earned through quiet strength. When we step back and analyze the larger picture, the most shocking revelation isn't the family drama itself, but how quickly the official excuses fell apart. The defense claimed the tiaras were taken for official state business, but investigators soon discovered one was slated for a private event by a non-working royal. This single, damning detail exposes a massive breach of protocol, proving the high-security vault was accessed under false pretenses. The scale of the removal far exceeded any actual duty, revealing a deeper play for power. William recognized this immediate threat, bypassing the usual channels to confront his father directly and demand a formal, immediate resolution to the crisis. This high-stakes move by the prince was far more than a husband defending his wife. It was a firm declaration of boundaries. By stripping Camilla of her tiaras for two major public events, the king delivered a devastating, silent punishment that reverberated throughout the high society elite. Anyone who understood royal protocol immediately recognized the significance of her bare head, a clear message delivered without a single word of public drama. This is the true nature of royal warfare, where power is negotiated through what is worn and what is missing. And when Catherine finally emerged at the banquet sporting the disputed crown, she was not just wearing a priceless jewel, she was wearing a symbol of total victory.